the national state. And I want to begin with that topic of highlighting for you really and for most of us, especially around here in this part of the world where we're sitting, we're provoked by nationalism. We're provoked because it resonates with a relatively recent and really damning historical epic. Nationalism led to two great wars. It led to the Holocaust. It led to millions of innocent deaths. Here in the Netherlands, people remain apprehensive, for example, of flying the Dutch flag and the wearing of the color orange because of this sort of aftertaste of nationalism. So nationalism provokes because it really recalls, even graphically, an ugliness that's in our collective past. And in countless other parts of the world, nationalism is provocative because it, for example, encapsulates a collective group of people's aspirations and struggles, right? In the past 3 decades or so, we have been witnessing really a resurgence of nationalist sentiments and separatist aspirations the world over. And we don't need to run through that list again. So nationalism provokes the masses because it really contains a particular organizing vision of the future, of a future that they may or may not wish to be a part of. And then there are us social scientists. We too are incredibly provoked by this topic of nationalism. The study of nationalism in our field of anthropology and also other fields, it gained a great deal of momentum and interest in the 1970s and the 1980s and through the 1990s. It wasn't that nationalism had not been researched previously, because of course it had, but it was sort of during that particular period of time when there were a lot of important studies published, and there were a lot of other studies that found many different avenues for publication. So there was a sort of explosion in academic attention and scholarly attention to this topic. So why then was there such a swell of interest in the scholarly study of nationalism during that period, during the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s? And I would say there are 3 main reasons for that burst of interest. The first, in Europe, we were seeing at that period of time a growth in these sort of separatist nationalist movements in places like Brittany and the Basque Country and Scotland and so forth, right? And these movements inevitably were sparking the interest of European scholars who were looking out upon their continent, their world, and trying to address what was happening. Secondly, during the same period of time, we saw a lot of nationalist successes and nationalist failures in the former European colonies, right? So in places like East Africa, we watched successful nation-building projects take place. We saw Kenyans emerge, whereas previously there had been only Luo, Kikuyu, and say Maasai people. And at the same time, we also, during this period, watched as post-colonial nationalisms in places like India and Sri Lanka yielded civil wars and lots of violence and violent separatist movements. And I think the third reason why this period of time was a productive period for the scholars of nationalism and why so many social scientists were drawn to this topic was because, of course, it was during this period that we saw really massive changes here in Europe. And in particular, I'm referring to the collapse of socialist rule in Eastern Europe, right? And there too, in that part of this continent, we saw dramatic political changes that were followed often by explosions of nationalist and separatist conflict in some of those regions, most notably the former Yugoslavia, all of which was drawing a lot of attention among European scholars to questions and issues surrounding nationalism. And I guess the problem for us social scientists, that one of the main reasons that we are so provoked by this topic, this phenomenon, is because we recognize that the so-called nation, we recognize it as being the only acceptable form of political organization in the world today, right? That is, for example, in the shape of the so-called nation state. And at the very same time, we are so quick to recognize that this nation is but a figment of our collective imagination. This sort of irony, this contradiction, that the nation is only a sort of imagined arbitrary construct, but that it holds such sway in the world today, perhaps not so unlike the state itself, it makes the topics of nations and nationalism a challenging one. So in essence, the nation, just like our state, is both illusory and real at the very same time. And for this reason, I guess I want to spend a bit of time setting the foundations for this next phase of the state by using my time to really reflect on two questions. What are nations, and what is nationalism? A very good starting point, in my opinion. So let me begin then by proposing a relatively straightforward definition of nations and nationalism. It's my own definition, but it's not so dissimilar from others. And then I want to spend sort of the rest of my time sort of unpacking that definition for you, right? So let me put the definition up on the board. Here it is. Nationalism is the political doctrine, principle, or program which holds that humanity, us humans, can be divided into separate discrete units, nations, and that each nation should constitute a separate political unit. In other words, a state. Nationalism is the political doctrine, principle, or program which holds that humanity can be divided into separate discrete units, nations, and that each nation should constitute a separate political unit, a state. That's the working definition I want to proceed with. And I want to do this by taking a much closer look at it. And I will start here with just this little bit of our definition. Nationalism is the political doctrine, principle, or program. So what are we talking about here? What is that telling us? Based on this definition, based on this part of the definition, nationalism offers us two possibilities. First, and it connects up with the words doctrine and principle, my definition suggests that nationalism can be a sort of political postulate, an axiom. In other words, a set of ideas and beliefs that are sort of accepted as true. So nationalism is a sort of taken for granted assumption. It's an unproven assumption, but it is an assertion of truth. And when you hear that, I would hope you're thinking it's an assertion of truth about what? That would be the question I'd hope you'd be thinking right now. And that answer will be provided and is provided in the second part of my definition, and also the third part, and we will get to that shortly. But the second possibility for this element of the definition, and it's equally valid, it relates to the word program, the third word there. And here I'm trying to suggest that nationalism is also, and often simultaneously so, a political agenda. nationalism comes with a very clear and explicit set of political motivations, with a clear set of aims, with a clear set of visions. And there is one very definitive objective of nationalism. And now, if you're following along, the question that I hope is in your head is, what then is nationalism's political agenda? What is its main objective? Again, that answer will follow in the second and third parts of the definition. And I guess one last comment about this part of the definition. In all instances, nationalism as a political postulate or a political doctrine or a political program or a political agenda, in all of these instances, what we see is that nationalism is an ideology. And I think that's sort of, in essence, the crux of this part of the definition. Nationalism is an ideology. Okay, I'm going to move to the second part of the definition. So nationalism is the political doctrine, principle, or program which holds that humanity can be divided into separate, discrete units, nations. And here appears the first assertion, that first taken for granted assumption about nationalism. The assumption that humanity, us human beings, can be divided, naturally so in most cases, into these separate, discrete units of peoples. And these units of peoples are supposedly called nations. So what then constitutes a nation? A nation is, by many accounts, a very large group, a social group, a group of people that is integrated not by one, but by a combination of several kinds of perceived relationships between its members. And we're talking about then a combination of perceived economic, political, linguistic, cultural, religious, geographical, and or historical connections between a large group of people. So an important Czech political theorist, Miroslav Hroch, identifies three characteristics that are most central to this concept of the nation. He says, first, members of a nation have a memory of some common past. A memory. What is that memory for people in the Netherlands? Probably has something to do with William of Orange. Certainly where I come from, that memory has to do with Columbus. And you all can probably point to various memories from your own so-called nations. The second point that Hroch makes is that there's a density of linguistic and or cultural ties enabling a higher degree of social communication within the group than beyond it. And that's something that a lot of us experience in our everyday life. I mean, many of you are not at home, and you're very far away from home. But I imagine that many of you have certain friends or circle of friends who come from where you come from. And there's a different sense of maybe comfort or understanding that takes place in that group because you speak your native languages, you share same cultural reference points, etc. And I think this is what Hroch is talking about. And the third point that he says is so central to the nation is that there exists a conception of the equality of all members of the group. Everyone in the who's part of the nation is, in theory, of course, in practice, it's another story, but is in theory an equal member of that nation. And if you're now thinking that this notion of a nation sounds a lot like the idea of an ethnic group, or that they sound remarkably similar, then I think you're sort of on a good track, a right track. A nation and an ethnic group are very similar concepts. They're interrelated concepts, and often they are indeed analyzed in conjunction with one another. Ethnic groups and nations share a common set of characteristics, not only with regard to the membership criteria for individuals, but also with respect to their reliance, these two concepts' reliance on three pivotal assumptions about the nature of the respective social grouping. So being of a nation, but also of an ethnic group, is defined by a perceived boundedness, a perceived continuity, and a perceived homogeneity. So in principle, the nation is bounded, right? That is, it is precisely marked off. It is delimited in both space and time. In space, because it's based on geographic borders, right? And in time, because the nation, and often an ethnic group as well, is said to have a birth. It is said to have a beginning in history. And secondly, in principle, the national entity is continuous, like an ethnic one, because it is supposedly uninterrupted in its history across time and in its national territory. The nation has always existed, at least from that point in time forward, and it has always existed here in this place. And thirdly, in principle, the nation is defined by homogeneity, like ethnic groups. The nation is often defined by a homogeneity which also encompasses diversity. Though individual members of the nation may differ, they share certain essential attributes that constitute their national identity. So this sameness is what overrides difference within a nation. And though this description of the nation seems to focus on the inclusive nature of the concept, right? That is, on sort of what makes us or what makes one a part of the so-called nation, it is absolutely essential for us to recognize that the nation, though it is built around, or is often built around the language of inclusiveness, is at the very same time as much about exclusiveness. The nation and nationalism has as much to do with exclusion, with keeping people outside the boundaries, rather than only pulling them in. So German nationalism under the Third Reich, for example, was not about which members of German society were a part of the nation, but rather about which members of German and later European society were not members of the nation. The same can be said about the more recent case in Rwanda, as well as the sort of less pernicious and historically obvious cases of nationalism, the sorts of nationalism that we encounter today in everyday life. Contemporary nationalism in Europe today is also very much about who is not part of the nation. And around here, that has a lot to do with immigrants, right? And immigration debates in society. So the point of emphasis on this exclusive nature of the nation is really an important one, and it's one we really need to keep in mind. It's about belonging, and it's about not belonging. Okay, one last comment relating to this part of the definition. I've been talking about, the nation, and you've been, if you're listening, hearing me use the word perceived a few times, or in principle. And I do that quite intentionally because it is now widely acknowledged that nations, like ethnic groups, like racial groups, like all social categories for that matter, are social constructs. Right? Now, Ernest Gellner, who's really was one of the most important anthropologists of nationalism, and someone we'll be discussing a bit down the road, he put it this way, and I quote Ernest Gellner: "Two men are of the same nation if and only if they recognize each other as belonging to the same nation." In other words, nations maketh man. Nations are the artifacts of men's convictions and loyalties and solidarities. A mere category of persons becomes a nation if and when the members of the category firmly recognize certain mutual rights and duties to each other in virtue of their shared membership of it. It is their recognition of each other as fellows of this kind which turns them into a nation, and not the other shared attributes, whatever they might be, which separate that category from non-members. And another important nationalism scholar, Benedict Anderson, someone else we'll be talking about, has defined nations much more concisely, simply as imagined communities. For many contemporary scholars, then, nations don't exist beyond the perceptions of those who think them into being. They don't exist beyond the imagination of those, and that's almost all of us, who think ourselves and live ourselves as part of a nation. And now, the last part of my definition. So nationalism is the political doctrine, principle, or program which holds that humanity can be divided into separate, discrete units called nations, and that each nation should constitute a separate political unit, a state. And with this part of the definition, we come upon nationalism's sort of second assertion, and also its political agenda, right? In addition to asserting that humanity can be divided into distinct nations, nationalism also asserts that these nations should occupy their own state. In other words, nationalism is a principle arguing that national and political units should be congruent with one another. In essence, that nations should govern themselves. And that's why the state becomes so important. As a principle or doctrine, nationalism argues that the nation must be as independent as possible, as politically sovereign as possible. People from other nations should not be put in charge of managing or running or leading my nation. Gellner puts it this way, I quote him again: "Nationalism holds that nations and states were destined for each other, that either without the other is incomplete and constitutes a tragedy." As for the political agenda, then, nationalism's goal is to establish or capture a state in the name of a respective so-called nation. So Kurdish nationalism, therefore, is a political movement aiming to establish an independent Kurdish state. And now that we've finally brought in the state, I guess I should make a few concluding remarks about nations, states, and nation states. Right? It's customary in the scholarly literature to distinguish between nation and state. A nation is this group of people that may or may not control its own state, while a state, in its most simplistic understanding, is a sort of political organization that may or may not correspond to only one nation. And we need to point out that there are many more nations or potential nations in the world than there are states. And that most nations that aspire to statehood will never attain it. And that, of course, many states, in fact, most states, encompass more than one nation. And it's also of interest, I think, to point out that states have created nations more frequently than the other way around, right? That is, states have created nations more often than nations have created states. And we find then that, for example, state breeding or state building creates a national identity as part of that process, rather than simply following from it. I started working in Namibia and in Southern Africa shortly after the fall of apartheid, shortly after those, particularly Namibia, became an independent country. And at the time I started working there, people's national identity was totally linked to their ethnic identity. And over time, over the past 30 years of my work there, I have seen how people's sense of national belonging has shifted from a divide and rule apartheid era conception, which centered around their ethnic, or in the words of that dispensation, tribal identities, to a new Namibian identity. People now refer to themselves as Namibian and not as Herero or Ovambo. So this alternative formulation, or this recognition, rather, leads some scholars to not want to speak about nation states, but rather state nations. Sometimes you find the words inverted. And the idea of a state nation serves the purpose of emphasizing the fact that the respective state came into being before the nation, right? In other words, that the state invented the nation. And I think that's really all I wanted to say today to start us off on our discussions. We'll have a bit of time on this topic. It's an important topic. It's a relevant topic for today's political climate all around the world. It remains as such. And I think, I hope I've pushed us off on the right direction. I look forward to our discussions, and I think I'll hand things over to our presenters.